Very pleased to be back. Just one comment about the watercolor that I just gifted to the school. That was painted during my last advanced painting class, my last term here, one of the last ones that I did. And during that class, when all of the students were supposed to be doing their own thing and motivating themselves, I was sitting down and occupying myself with the figure. So that's one of the many that I did in that class and many of the other classes. So it was a pleasure to give that. It really represents in that painting everything that I believe in about painting and the watercolor. And what I'm going to be talking about. The colors kind of relates to this picture anyway here. Let me begin with, I want to make some comments using this image of my palette about the watercolor material. And the palette, of course, is a huge part, an extension of watercolor painting. You can see that it has a white surface and that allows you to see clearly the light coming through the colors. And that's the whole idea of it, so that you can reflect on your painting through the palette for that reason, so that it's an important surface of light to begin with. I kind of think of it as many of you know that I use metaphors in which I often use music, for example. And I feel that it's kind of a chromatic springboard to the painting. And in teaching watercolor, it's a very important, if you're listening to me and following me as in my work, that much of the discussion begins and during and in the end of the palette, perhaps more important than what's going on with painting. It's a very, very critical process of getting engaged with the painting. Not just a utility, but it's really a kind of a seeing device. That you should be immediately connected to the painting. So the basic materials, you have water, paper, pigments, transparent and opaque medium, and of course the palette. And one more important item to me is bicycle. Bicycling is a very important part of my process that keeps me standing on my feet and doing the painting because it takes a lot of energy. And also it's part of an extension of my studio. I work out my problems daily, my painting problems daily. That is in the painting. A friend of mine who's a painter quoted from Charles Demuth about looking at a watercolor. And Demuth was supposed to have said in seeing a good watercolor, quote, "Look at that." And often those of you who admire and appreciate watercolor are often stunned in just that way by looking at a really good and brilliant watercolor. It has an immediate appeal to you. But the real appeal is beneath the surface and layers of transparent colors that really begin at the bottom and not at the top. So that really represents what in advertising, what I'm going to be talking about is the paradox at the medium, of the medium. What you see is not necessarily what you get. In a watercolor, that immediate peel and surface is sort of the knife point, you might say, of the medium, but there's a lot of knife behind that point. The medium is as described, as I've written about it. It's on one hand, it's free, and yet you have this control that is often for new students very intimidating. It's a transparent medium, but it's opaque paint. The pigment contained within the watercolor pigment, which is bound by gum arabic, is opaque, just as it is in oil paint. It goes from transparent to opaque. So the medium, the transparency is about dispersion with water. The pigment is opaque. So that's an interesting paradoxical contradiction that you're constantly balancing between the medium. You're dispersing it out on the paper, and yet the pigment is opaque. Fundamentally, in working with the watercolor medium, I'll go to the next one here and speak briefly to that, is it's about the basement, it's about the foundation, that as you work through that in the medium, that becomes the roof in the painting. You have to understand that. The interesting contradiction of the medium is the immediacy of the surface and the appearance of the surface that you're seeing, those dazzling touches of painters like Turner and Homer and so on and so forth there. But what keeps you, once you're impressed enough by that, what keeps you coming back for more, is really what's underneath, deeply underneath, those layers and layers of transparent voices of color that add depth, a profound depth often, to the watercolor medium. I was thinking of another metaphor, a way of trying to describe it before I comment about this painting. This is actually my very first watercolor. Real watercolor, let's say. I painted watercolor before that, but I didn't know what I was doing. Is the idea of the cake. We all like cake. You look at cake and you're immediately impressed and licking your chops about the icing. But which is great. Icing is good. I love icing, but it really is about the cake. So if you're using that as a metaphor for watercolor is just that way. It's about the icing at the cake. But we've all had cake where the icing is sweet and pretty tasty, but underneath, too bad. There's a lot of diners across America that have cakes like that. So it's very much like that cake, and I'd like to pick up on that idea as we go along. Just before I start talking about this, what I would like to do is to talk about my more recent work as it comes out of the past in the present, and try to kind of get you inside the cake of the watercolor and discuss what's going on inside the watercolor, because these early works, such as this one right here, which is titled probably Barnes, I think painted in 1977. This was literally an epiphany day for me. I was out painting oils and borrowed my friend's Winsor Newton half pan set and number 32 brush and pencil and her paper. And you know who I'm talking about, Robert. We happened to be at a place of these barns that represented something really important to me, and that is structure and my understanding of structure, visual structure and painting structure, that framework in a painting that holds it together, the structure that holds an idea together, and so on and so forth. So I had immediately affirmation of that, gee, this is good. Maybe I should start doing watercolors. So I did. And also I was awakened by one of the most important materials in watercolor, that being the paper. Without the paper is the light source of the painting. Both visually as white, it's white light, you're painting on light, and also transparently as the white of the paper comes through slowly and with great speed, the colors that are on top of it. So this painting, literally that all fell together. All of the knowledge and appreciation that I have spent in previous years of studying, particular English watercolor and American watercolor, but really more I was anchored in traditional forms of watercolor with the early English painters, John Sell Cotman, Thomas Girton, and the great William Turner, who I came to appreciate later. This was done with a very direct approach. I knew nothing about skill. I only knew that I had a really good sense of loading the brush up and how to begin to build that foundation or that basement of the watercolor. Edward Hopper. I'm showing you this particular painting by Hopper, which is Pemaquid, because that's where I've been painting for the last 25 years or more, but more recently where I've been painting for the last year and a half. Now I'm kind of focusing on that subject. I'll pick up on that later. So what is this painting about? I guess using the cake metaphor here, there is absolutely no icing with Hopper, none whatsoever. He doesn't dazzle you, but he just profoundly moves you. And that's where Hopper is right now. You can see, given what I said about the paper, it's well anchored into the paper. It's beautifully framed by a beautiful tonal balance of color. And he's not fancy, just plain blunt, good, and Hopper that way. And amazing that it should be encouraging to the novice watercolor that all you need to do is pick up a brush and put it down and be pretty direct and pretty blunt about it and frame up your watercolor. This reflects not only an iconic, represents both an iconic subject on the coast of Maine, which I've become known as my subject, but the simplicity of the painting, the honesty of it, and all of that, and it has this sort of timeless to the moment quality too. That is why Hopper is one of America's greatest painters. There's something very American about this. It's a very honest day's work to accomplish something that is so brilliant and so satisfying and so lasting. A lot happened since that last watercolor. Like 18 years happened. And I wandered through a lot of white paper and gradually working in a very direct, very Hopper-esque way and trying to, through the process, the simple, let's say, Hopper-esque process as I described it to you, just sort of bluntly putting it down and trying to empower it as an image. So image has been has been through a long process with me trying to come up with the right image with a medium, particularly the watercolor medium, that has a kind of lasting, iconic, deep basement cake-like quality. And fast forward about 18 years up into the early to more mid to late 90s, which this is the beginning. This painting is in the Farnsworth Museum, by the way. That's actually about the actual size of it. I had been doing numerous very large-scale photographs paintings before that, not only trying to come up with something that's very empowered and very iconic, but also in terms of its scale, saying the same thing. Big image, big picture, that's what was going on in New York at that time anyway. So many of us, Susan Shatter and many other artists, well, not many others, just a very handful of artists, were working on a very large scale then. This is while I was showing with my long tenure with Peter Tatishev. This is part of that later 90s period, which I'm calling my iconic period. And there's probably 8 to 10 paintings like this that I feel that, which is why I'm showing you these, that really kind of anchored and established my vision. And ordinary places that are bathed in white that become memorable moments in America, so to speak. This is in our town in Rockland, up in Maine. Interesting thing about this painting, what's been happening here, the paradox, using that word again and again, which is easy to do with the medium and with painting too. With painting, it's all about two-dimensional surface, but you have this deep space, visual space and emotional space there. It seems like a contradiction that way. But interesting what's going on with the values here. The values are stronger, yet at the same time the values are brighter, because in color, the darker the value, the brighter the light. Saturation, brilliant color. The more saturation, the more light-giving it is. So I was becoming very engaged within this image framework by really pushing the color. You can see the abstract kind of Mondrian-esque framework. Mondrian was a very big thing to me, among other modernist and formalist painters here. And, the red stripes, blue stripes, and so on and so forth, and other painters that those of you who paint are knowledgeable of 20th century painting can associate with that. Just to make a comment, Hopper is a really big thing with me. But so are modern painters, abstract painters, because good painting is abstract in a representational skin or in a non-representational, non-objective skin. This is one of my all-time favorites. You can see that something's happening. It's like the curtain is passing over a period. Now that I'm assessing myself, as if that's somebody else there, and as if the curtain is passing over, the shadow is passing over, and something else is just a little bit of white that's left. And what was satisfying about painting this painting is as I do now, as you'll see later on, is if you eliminate the subject matter, you can see what that painting is. It's completely sort of non-objective painting. I start non-objectively. You should start non-objectively rather than rushing to the party right away or the subject matter here. So I layered this and build up the light in the shadows with increasing layers and layers of pigment, of color. What you can't quite see in this, which is really important, given what I said about the paradox of the medium, is the floating suspension, transparent suspension of that opaque pigment that layer by layer drops one on top of the other to create this sort of galactic galaxy of color pigments. That's what creates the depth. So if you know how to layer wet on top of dry, you can continue going on and on and on without making mud. This has a lot of layers to it, and yet you have a very strong sense of the light of the paper and also the light of the color that are combined together to give this brilliant mood, deep mood feeling in the painting. This is this was like a 20 by 30 painting done in the studio from many visits with a very good friend of mine who is a very good watercolor painter, Paul Rickert. This is Church Street in Stonington, Maine. And this has a lot of feeling to it. It's sort of an ordinary street, some ordinary street. We go to Maine and you see ordinary things up in Maine, and we go away with our jaws dropping how beautiful it is. So this sort of represents the extraordinary in that ordinary place, a kind of a timelessness. And I'm showing this because it's continued use of light and shadow, but you can see that it has a real deep feeling of emotional feeling of light in it because of the layered granular colors that I poured over and over and over, trying to build it up to a point where it almost felt emotional to it. I think it does. It's a very, I don't want to call it an emotional painting, but I think it's a very deeply felt, deeply wrought painting in that way. And that's exactly the way I feel. And that's what keeps me going through hours and hours and days of working on these studio paintings. Something has to keep you connected because it's a long, drawn-out process. So if I get worn out that way, I hop on my bike and I go down the road and I come back and I feel better. So this kind of painting, along with the last one that you saw and the late 90s paintings, are the real transition paintings for me, moving me into the present day. Where are we here? This is still part of that period. These are like the blast from the past. These are the iconic subjects. This is Marshall Point, very near our house in Maine, and you'll soon see Pemaquid. Again, very, very powerful, very open light. The buildings were kind of moving aside. I began to use them as a kind of a framework for the light, to empower the light, empower the moment in the painting. And also extremely fussy sense of the structure and design of the picture planes, so that I'm making the most out of the white light and the transparent light of the paper. This is Pemaquid. These paintings are 30 by 40 inches, and they're about to get bigger again. In looking at this painting, as with the recent paintings, I spend a lot of time working on location, over and over and over and over and over again, sometimes almost doing the same thing over and over again at different times of day, trying to establish and get grounded in what I want to do, because you really have to take a very big physical, emotional breath to step into something that's 30, 40, or 60 inches. So I've kind of gotten used to that desperate place to be in the painting. And I see that was quoted in the announcement of my talk, a quote that I took from T.S. Eliot, from his poem, late poem, The Little Gidding. And he said, "The end of our exploring shall be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." I mean, that's it. Is you keep on painting, keep on rehashing things, but somehow you have to rediscover it and to turn your subject, to turn your image completely inside out and try to rediscover something that you may have missed. And you probably did because you were young and stupid way back when you began to look at it naively with the lack of insight that maturity as an artist gives you. So all of these works, this is 40 by 60, and it really takes in the whole, I mean, you think of Pemaquid this way, other than the dramatic rocks and sea, but it is, we all know what a lighthouse is and the purpose it serves for those that are out at sea. And it's an important guidepost, certainly an important symbol that has resonated throughout American art, in particular through artists like Edward Hopper here. So it's not about the lighthouse. It's about the light and it's about the moment. That's the image of this painting. The lighthouse is just the subject matter here. It's a great day on the coast of Maine. We just had one. My wife and I and friends just had one at Pemaquid a couple of days ago, a day like today. You go away thinking, I had a good day. That was a great day. That was memorable. That was a moment. That's what this painting and all of these paintings that symbolize that sense of moment. The technical aspect of that is that the layers and layers and layers of granular color, intense opaque color layered, suspended by water, and then as it dries, layer by layer, that's what sort of builds the kind of visual soul of the painting. This is Pemaquid Porch, and probably at that time the most challenging painting I ever painted. There's some really serious geometry and perspective there in that painting. And I didn't take Peter's class, but I was kind of born to understand perspective, but I probably would flunk out of Peter's class anyway. Serious, again, looking through history, there's a lot of history going to the Renaissance in this painting there as sort of the intellectual foundation of it. That's what I saw. Particular Piero della Francesca, without getting into all of that geometry and golden section, but there it is. It's all mapped out, but it just looks like it should look, not bound to rules and regulations and mathematics there, but again, that sense of, vertiginous sense of drawing you to and into the space. It represents that moment. Okay, here is the other, let me flip forward. Turner. To me, Turner is the greatest watercolorist of all time that'll ever live. In some ways, coming out of his early period, this is what was referred to as the color beginnings. These semi-abstract to abstract, what appear to be abstract for us, but they're not. They just look abstract through contemporary eyes. Kind of color essences that he put down. And they represented an image to him. Not the image of the subject, but the image in this case is the medium. And that image, reflecting on many of Turner's paintings, particularly, let's say, of Venice. You know, you look at Turner's Venice watercolors, which these all arrived out of, and many of his late masterworks anyway. And those are memories of Venice. So Turner is imagining those memories in color. So I use the term in my watercolor classes, color narrative. Color tells a story. Color has emotion, blues, reds, oranges. They all have different degrees of effects in space and certainly different degrees of emotion. Anybody that teaches color teaches that. What is that color? How does that color hit you? What's your favorite color? And so on and so forth. Why? All those things, the way Turner used color. And also the masterful sense of, he probably did this in his sleep, for all I know. He was such a genius with the medium. So again, I love the term color beginnings. And that really represents the foundation of the way I begin. So it might go something like this. With Hopper, it was an observed image through the medium, very bluntly stated. It's about that image within the simplicity and the economy of the medium. Again, as I mentioned with Turner, it's an imagined image through the medium. The medium is the subject. If you think about it, look at Turner. He makes you look at the medium. He squeezes you through his interpretation, the nuance and the exaggeration of the space to lead you around his mind, so to speak. To me, in using Hopper as an example, hey, there are dozens of other artists, but those are pretty good contrasts. Those are diametrically opposed contrasts. The medium is very diametric that way, opaque, transparent. Down is up, and so on and so forth. Here, to me, those are my contrasts. As I go into the more recent work, on one hand is the structure, over 25 years of structure, and dealing with images such as architecture and the architecture of light, that I use those motifs as Hopper, as a vehicle of really learning about structure, learning about an abstract framework that I need to physically, tactily get my hands on that way. And then the other part of it suddenly, I mean, I love Turner, but I rediscovered Turner. Speaking of what I just read to you about T.S. Eliot there, I thought Turner was really great, but when I really began to dig into deeper into color, and to use color within the same framework that I was working in, then I realized that those are the two extremes that are going on between, that I'm kind of juggling in my painting. Let me go back to this one right here. I just showed you this is what it looks like. Those are the colors, and you can see that it has a kind of harmony to it. And as a palette should give you a sense of the harmony, the direction of the initial notes that you're using in your painting. You're taking that harmony of color and putting it into a physical framework and letting it kind of harmonize that way, let's say. So on one hand, what's interesting in contrast between the earlier work that are really digging more into value, which is a much more static tool. Now with the color, it doesn't sit still anymore. It occupies a space that only color can occupy. So this is the beginning of a painting that you are about to see. It's the what, it demonstrates the what, when, where of the medium. And in saying that is, what do you choose to start with? If you're starting with the subject matter, then you're completely, as the object, for example, then you're completely missing the point there. For one very important reason is painting just doesn't start that way. It starts with an initial note, a touch of paint, a shape of color, and then it builds into something that, oh, I see where this is going, that kind of thing. The idea of that, getting to that point where I see this, where this is going, is to establish a framework, or let's say a really good outline, or like this looks like it's going to be a really good cake. That as I'm mixing those ingredients on the paper, and who cares about the icing? I'm jumping ahead, I'll jump back. This is the very large, not this large, painting that I did from, you saw me working on, that I did. Again, what I was trying to do here is to sort of defy nature in a way that, as if I'm trying to make the sky the building and the building the sky. And that easily is done by contrasting color, particularly working through the medium where the entire surface is bedazzled with granulation color. I use a lot of opaque colors, but I use them very transparently as I describe the medium. The transparency of the medium, not the transparency of the pigment. So this is layers and layers and layers of building that kind of color emotion, that color narrative. That is like with the Turner. This was one of the studies done on location. And one of the many studies, dozens and dozens of them on location at particular late afternoon times of the day. In terms of studying the light, watching the light, often just being there, looking at the light and not doing anything, but just looking at it. It's easy to do that in Maine. Even in the winter, year-round, this was my subject. This is sort of a bridge to where I wanted to be, which is what it is. It's a bridge to the light, and many of the paintings were named after that. This was during that winter where the snow was about 8 feet deep, and I had the sort of, I didn't have hip waders, but I was out there with a little thing just putting in some color studies, and then I would sit in the car and back and forth because I was freezing to death. But this will give you an example of the beginning. Where to begin is important to pair up the most important colors that as they match up, like complementary colors, let's say. But I don't want to simplify it to that point. As they match up, the beginning of the painting and the paper begin to resonate as if the sun just came out. That's the whole idea. I like to think of it and metaphorically referring it to as a chess game, which I can't play chess. I know how to play it, but I can't play chess. But one move, two moves, checkmate. That's the ultimate goal, is to get it in 2 moves, maybe 3. You can't do it. But that's the ultimate motivation, particularly because of the necessity of the economy of the medium, and the light is changing, and in this case, you're freezing to death. Okay, this is, I thought I'd throw this up. This is one of my Greece paintings from way back. On one of my many journeys, I used to do workshops in Europe, all around the Mediterranean, Greece, Spain, Italy, Morocco, Turkey, and so on and so forth. And I didn't think about this at the time, but when I began working on this bridge series, somebody said to me, my dealer in Maine, Cynthia, said, "You know, these look like temples." I see where that came from. My appreciation of classicism, classical art, and certainly as it is clearly foot on the ground represented by temples like this. This is Poseidon at Sunium, one of the great places and moments in architecture and Western thought, I think. It's an amazing place to be, especially at the end of the day when the sun is going down. So paintings like this, of which there are many, served as a foundation. I was already thinking about what I was doing 22, 23 years later with Temple. Again, I described what's going on here with the color. There are, behind all this, there's probably 2 or 3 dozen paintings that are 5 minutes apart in time as the light is going down. Some of them very fast, sort of color beginning studies. Some of them more finished, like the other ones, but most of them rather loose. Oops, I just wanted to skip back to that loose, this one here. Okay, just want to make a comment about paper, the material. I had been working for a long time on Arches paper, which is a very agreeable paper. I found that my skills were getting the best of me, and I needed to make a change, and I wasn't learning enough about the medium. Just didn't have any energy. It was too much about process, more about vision and image, and nice technique, Dave, looks good, bingo. But I needed to kind of get into the muscular organic part of the medium again and explore it through more accidental things that happen on papers like this. This is done on Strathmore 400 drawing paper, which is probably the most common paper that I paint on now. As the last one, this is the same thing. That was Arches Text Laid, the Sunion. This is the last one of Marshall's Point. The entire process of what I was doing at Marshall Point, again, that and Pemaquid, the 2 most important sort of iconic locations for me in Maine and in my work, came down to this, distilled down to the economy of what I was just saying about the craft of chess, 3 moves. It's like 3 shapes, and yet it has an expansive sense of thought to it. This painting is called Full Center, Marshall Point, full center. And the point of that is that that moon is not in full center. It's in the full visual center, but not in the actual axial center of the painting. That's tension, that's dynamic. That's what really makes this painting work. One of the key things that makes this painting work. I found that all extremely satisfying when this just kind of almost fell together over a long period of struggling to get it to work. Now we're on to Pemaquid. This is Pemaquid, which is just probably one of the grandest, most iconic locations on the coast of Maine. There ain't no doubt about it. The lighthouse itself, but the way it sits in this expanse of light is astounding. And that, as I describe it to you, what I find it to be so interesting is that expanse of light, that moment, like, wow, was that beautiful down there today. How to achieve that is what the effort is all about. So this is one of my small on Strathmore watercolor paper. I think it really has a really good sense of light and movement to it. Pushing the dark colors so that it exaggerates, increases the light to increase the luminosity of it, and increase the color vibrancy of the painting, both in contrast, side by side, and color vibrancy in terms of its layers and layers and layers. Or not a whole lot of layers. There's maybe about 3, maybe 4 layers in some place in this painting. Another small, you can see the little drips and puddles and things in this. This is the bell tower on the right. This is like a small 18 by 11-inch watercolor on a Strathmore paper. And the grass is green, but it really is yellow-green right out of the tube almost. So the more opaque you go with a medium, the brighter it has to be in color. Otherwise, it looks dead and very unsatisfying in the painting. Here we are. I'm actually just stepping into these big space moments. It's the first time I've seen it this big. I'm kind of excited about it. But it's really a small little 16-inch painting, of which I've done maybe 12 of these, studying the light and sitting the light in as a kind of a moment in that light, but not a moment that draws your attention to it, but a moment that expands the space and the timelessness of the space around it in color. This is done in the dead of winter on, as you can imagine what this was like. Painting is not bad. The moment was even better. And I don't have any slides of this smaller studies, but I do little color begetting things of just pairings of color, one shape next to another shape to see if it kind of kicks up and resonates. Jeez, look at this. Wow. I'm impressed with that painting. You can see that if you cut this in half, going back to the painting with all the shadow, which was called Last Light, which represented, that's it. I'm passing through here. I often will cut a painting in half. If you look at the left half of the painting, Emma, who the heck are you looking at? You're not looking at me. Is that you? Trying to adjust those stripes and pairings of color to dealing with the weight of it, the contrast of it, and the vibrancy of it, and to adjusting all of the colors to leaving more paper here, increasing the intensity of the pigment there, so that it all looks like it's the same light, whether it's transparent light or whether it's opaque light. That's what gives this painting a kick. The water actually has a lot of opacity into it. In some places, almost near opaque. I think right in here, you can see that it looks like it's breaking out in a rash. That's cobalt violet over cerulean blue. Interesting thing about associating music and voices to it. Voices that sing You hear all the voices, and yet you hear the music from all those voices together. It's a beautiful metaphor for the watercolor medium. This is actually, I did this, I can't believe, well, I did this about 3 weeks ago. This is where I am right now. As I mentioned, trying to get you into the head of watercolor, not the touch of watercolor. Stay off the touch, stay away from your fingers, stay in your head, stay in the earth, stay in the ground, stay in the basement, build it up. You don't have to impress anybody. You just have to have some kind of satisfying knowledge of the way it goes together. Ultimately, as you go down the road, one painting after the other until you drop over, it's all about the process and the work that goes into the watercolor that has to be satisfying. So to learn watercolor, if you're in my class, I have to teach you how to be enthusiastic about the beginning, about the bottom, and not the top. I can't teach you how to paint like Turner, nor can I teach you how to paint like Sargent. Appreciate that, get inspired by that, but then move away from it and to go someplace where you... Okay, last, I'm actually in the middle of working on this painting, just to show you where I am. This is a big painting. This is stage 1. Again, laying on the colors in watercolor, you have to have a very balanced tone to begin with. That tone has to be very high, to be very low, to be very bright, to be very dull, but it has to be somewhere around the middle, and it has to be balanced so that it begins to resonate, to blend in, to duet or trio that way. That's the beginning of it. You can see that there's a very little sense of the subject and a lot of light coming from that big rectangular shape of color. And then the transition through the color into the subject. Again, the subject, as I mentioned with Turner, is the medium, the light through the medium. The subject matter is the place. And so that's what really represents, if you're trying to describe a sense of place, I'm a sense of place painter. That's how you describe it, to stay away from the subject, but to deal with the moment as if that's the object you're looking at. So thank you very much.